Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Global Forum at ICOS. The Global Forum is a student-led organization dedicated to promoting global awareness, understanding, and citizenship throughout UCSD and the communities it serves through public lectures, panel discussions, and events. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Dr. David Moseley for a discussion called Easter and the Myth of Redemptive Violence. But first, some announcements. Next week, on Monday, April 13th, the Ambulante Film Festival will be making a stop at the Global Forum before beginning their festival in Baja California on April 16th through the 23rd. They'll be here the 13th, then they're going to Baja on the 16th. We will be showing the documentary El Alcalde about former Mayor Mauricio Fernandez, a controversial figure who was not afraid to take justice into his own hands to keep his city clean of drug cartels. The documentary is 80 minutes long, so please be sure to arrive on time at 7 p.m. because we will be sure to start on time at 7 p.m. Following that, on Monday, April 20th at 7 p.m., the Global Forum will be hosting a discussion titled U.S.-Cuba Relations in Transition. On December 17, 2014, President Obama announced that the United States would seek to normalize relations with the island of Cuba, one of the most significant policy changes in 50 years. Professor Richard Feinberg from UCSD School of International Relations and Pacific Studies will talk about current and future U.S.-Cuba relations. Lastly, don't forget to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, check out our blog, and sign up for our e-newsletter at the registration table to keep track of all of our future events. We also just launched our new YouTube channel, so be sure to check out any past events that you may have missed. So far, we have most of the events from the winter quarter up there already, including a great talk on India, an especially good talk on Voices of Islam, a student-led discussion. So I highly recommend that you check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now, let me introduce our speaker, Dr. David Moseley. He is founder of the Global Education Initiative and teaches religious studies and philosophy at the Bishop's School in La Jolla. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in law, theology, and philosophy from Oxford and Cambridge, and a doctorate in theology from Cambridge. He has been teaching theology and biblical studies at the University of San Diego since 1997. He is also a theologian in residence at St. Paul's Episcopal Cathedral in San Diego, a member of the faculty of the San Diego Diocesan School of Ministry, and teaches adult education classes throughout the county. Please welcome to the stage Dr. David Moseley.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Christopher, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm very intimidated by speaking at an event that's called a Global Forum, especially when I hear about your past events and your future events. I really don't feel worthy to pontificate on issues of global significance. Last time I saw a Global Forum, there's actually a Monty Python sketch called Global Forum. And I don't know if you've seen the sketch, but in the sketch there's a very distinguished panel gathered around a table. Vladimir Lenin is there, Karl Marx is there, Che Guevara is there, and Mao Zedong is there. And these very distinguished panel are gathered together, and then the question master proceeds to conduct the interview like it's a 1960s game show, asking them trivia questions, which they're all pretty horrified that they don't know the answer to the very silly questions about who wins what sports events, and they don't know certain hit singles. And there's a kind of a priceless moment where Karl Marx fails to win a lounge suite, and the look on his face is quite amazing, how disappointed he is. Anyway, Thank you for coming out tonight. It's nice to see all the people who can't stand college basketball here. I want to start tonight with something from the Colbert Report. I'm a teacher who starts every one of my classes with a little snippet from the Colbert Report, and I'm terrified that Comedy Central might remove the archive of past Colbert Report clips because I'll have 5 minutes of empty space in all of my classes in perpetuity. But there's a great segment on the Colbert Report I will show you to my students today called Easter Under Attack, which is the model on those kind of Fox News, Christmas, the war on Christmas kind of things. And this is about Easter Under Attack. And one of these episodes a few years ago was about the publication or the release of a translation of one of the Gnostic Gospels. These are Gospels written in the 3rd and 4th century, many, many years after Christianity, and many, many years after the Gospels that we find in the Christian New Testament. A Gospel that was attributed to Judas. And this is what Stephen Colbert said about the recently translated ancient text, the Gospel of Judas. He was upset that it claimed that Jesus asked Judas to betray him. That's right, this is quoting Colbert. Judas was a good guy, and that totally ruins Easter for me. Because the best part of the resurrection is how it's a payback for Judas's betrayal. That's right, Easter is ultimately a tale of revenge. What fun is Easter Mass if you can't finish it by pumping your fist in the air and shouting, "In your face, Judas Iscariot"? Because in my family, that's a tradition. Having Jesus conspire with Judas is like those lame cartoons where Tom and Jerry are friends. I, for one, am sticking to the real Gospels in the Bible where Judas and Jesus are mortal enemies. All joking aside, somehow I believe that out of the narrative of the Easter weekend, from the crucifixion on Good Friday to the resurrection on Easter Sunday, many Christians have unfortunately extrapolated from that narrative a message of redemptive violence. We'll delve a little bit more into redemptive violence in a moment, but I think this is part of a tradition of projecting onto or appropriating facets of the Jesus story and the Jesus narrative that suit the audience's particular self-interests. Gandhi identified this problem many years ago when he very famously said, "I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." Which is very similar to something my high school English teacher used to say, "I like God, it's just his friends I can't stand." And you don't have to look very far to see some of the many different cultural appropriations or projections that have distorted the identity and the message of Jesus. I was recently in Baja California for the weekend, and I was driving down to Puerto Nuevo on Good Friday to eat lobster, just as Jesus intended. And as we were heading out towards Rosarito, there is a ginormous statue of Jesus up on the hill. He must be about 5 or 6 stories high. It's not like the Jesus statue in Rio de Janeiro, which is very plain, very abstract. This is like a giant dashboard Jesus, but kind of raised to the nth degree. He's got a red robe on. He's got a sacred heart. He's kind of holding his hands out, kind of zombie-ish. But the greatest part about it was when I was driving home later that night, I noticed that Jesus' head was flashing red. Because they actually do have the statue of Jesus is so tall, they do have a little flashing light on top of his head, just so that planes and helicopters don't crash into Jesus. Which would be kind of an awesome way to go, right? You die crashing your light aircraft into a giant statue of Jesus. But you can find all sorts of different cultural appropriations of Jesus. This is something that's very popular with young girls. Jesus can be your boyfriend. Oh, here we go. I've got my images out of order. Here's the giant Jesus in Rosarito. I did for a little while think he was standing on the giant Easter egg, but then it looks a little bit more like the the nuclear reactor in San Onofre. But there, can you see this little flashing light up there? Some people have made Jesus into a hater, right? You may have seen Westboro Baptist Church from Kansas who used to show up and protest at soldiers' funerals and hold up their sign, God hates fags, right? But if you read the Gospels very carefully, Jesus curses the fig tree. It's the figs that Jesus doesn't like. Jesus is not a fundamentalist. Jesus does not read the Bible as the literal word-for-word truth of God. Jesus never interprets the Jewish scriptures in that way. He is a rabbi, and he follows the rabbinical traditions where he sees metaphor and symbolism and depth and layers in the sacred texts of Judaism, and would be horrified to think that people would not find similar depth, metaphor, and symbolism in his expostulation of the Jewish texts. Jesus is not a misogynist, for certain, although many interpret his life and message to somehow endorse a system of patriarchy that is discriminatory towards women. Jesus is by no means unscientific. Jesus did not think the Flintstones was a documentary. Jesus, surprisingly, is not a Republican. There's a Republican Jesus saying, and after I performed the miracle with the loaves and the fishes, I sold them to a multitude and a huge market. But of course, he's not a Democrat either. He's not a capitalist, nor is he a socialist. He's not sectarian. Last extensive survey of religious denominations in the United States revealed that there was somewhere in the region of 33,000 different types of Christianity in the United States, all tax exempt. Jesus generally is not insensitive when it comes to issues of class and socioeconomic justice. Jesus himself, who was a refugee, according to Matthew's Gospel, in Egypt, just after his birth, is by no means anti-immigrant. Jesus is certainly not against healthcare for everyone. It's part of the way in which he finds his vocation in life. Of course, he's not a wimp. When someone asks, what would Jesus do? Remember, freaking out and flipping tables is a viable option. But neither is Jesus violent. Jesus said to them, if you don't have a legal action, Winchester, sew your cloak and Bible. And if that image of violent Jesus, or Jesus who is weaponized, strikes you as somewhat odd and peculiar, this is what we're going to be talking about tonight. The way in which somehow the message and the life of Jesus and theological interpretations of Jesus' death and resurrection have somehow intermingled or interspersed, violent interpretations layered onto the stories of Jesus' life. President Obama, if you recall, in February, speaking at the National Prayer Breakfast, got into a lot of trouble for reminding his audience at a time when religious violence and extremism is particularly associated with Islamofascism, that Christianity itself has its own very shameful history of violence and inquisition and persecution. Even though we assume or suppose that Islam has a monopoly on that particular admixture of religion and violence today. But this is by no means a problem just simply for Islam and Christianity. This is also a chronic issue in political Zionism and religious Zionism in Israel. The election of President Modi, Prime Minister Modi in India is exacerbating conflicts between Hindu nationalists and other members of religious minorities in India. Remember that quote from Gandhi earlier? Remember, Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist who was over-concerned that Gandhi's concept of a secular India was too broad and embracing, such as to include Muslims, which was anathema to the Hindu nationalists. Gandhi's favorite text as well, the Bhagavad Gita, which is this very learned philosophical debate between Arjuna and Lord Krishna before a battle about duty and obligation and the Dharma and the central principles of Hindu philosophy, all takes place before Arjuna is about to engage in a genocidal slaughter of many people who are his own relatives and cousins. Hard to believe, but particularly in Myanmar and other parts of southern Asia and Sri Lanka, there has been an uptick in Buddhist violence, Buddhist political violence and religious violence in recent years. So what is the myth of redemptive violence? How do we end up with this notion that somehow the message of Jesus and the central core teaching of Christianity is inextricably linked with violence? These are some images that were embedded in the vintage numbers of weapons supplied to the US military in Afghanistan and Iraq that included religious quotes inserted on there by the manufacturers of those weapons in the United States and then distributed to troops. This is a sight on a machine gun. This is another part of a weapon. You can imagine what the Arabs and the Afghanis in Iraq and Afghanistan thought of weapons with those sorts of identifications being used against them, for those who denied that this was a clash of civilizations. Last silly image for the night. This is a picture from the gift shop of my favorite place in America, the Holy Land Experience, which is a religious theme park in Orlando, Florida. And I'm not making this place up. You can go to Orlando, Florida, and if you don't want to go to Universal Studios or Disneyland, you can go to the Holy Land Experience, and you can, it's just like SeaWorld. You can have the Last Supper with Jesus, just like you can have lunch with Shamu, and you can see, instead of an electric parade, or they crucify Jesus at 12, 3, and 6 every day. And they have a very upmarket gift shop there, and they have this beautiful picture of Jesus in the gift shop, which my son is posing next to again. And of course, if you look very, very closely, on Jesus' boxing gloves, it says, mercy. Because, yes, when Jesus sucker punches you, that really means mercy. What is the myth of redemptive violence? The myth of redemptive violence is a phrase that was coined by a theologian called Walter Wink about a decade ago, as he looked at the saturation of violent narratives in our culture, from cartoons fed to children on Saturday mornings, Tom and Jerry and Popeye and Bluto, to Disney movies, and then up through more sophisticated forms of television drama and Hollywood blockbusters, sport, and politics, and global affairs. Throughout this continuum of narrative mass entertainment culture, there seems to be a whole series of messages that conflicts and disputes can only be resolved violently, and that violence is the most legitimate and the most obvious default solution to those conflicts. And we see that in many different parts of our culture, from low popular entertainment all the way up to high culture and elevated forms of entertainment as well. I was at a reading 6 or 7 years ago here in La Jolla by Khalid Hosseini. Many of you, I'm sure, read his book, The Kite Runner. Anyone read The Kite Runner? Many of you read The Kite Runner. And he was on a book tour just as The Kite Runner was at the top of the bestsellers list. He was speaking in a gymnasium in La Jolla, to a crowd. I'd read The Kite Runner. I'd actually been recommended it by my friend Dr. Nagala here. He's the head of the I House, and we were together at that event. And I really enjoyed the book, but I was very disturbed by the fact that the book does legitimize this idea of the myth of redemptive violence. Without wanting to spoil the book for you, the book tells the story of two childhood friends, one of whom betrays the other one by allowing him to be subject to an act of grotesque sexual violation and violence, and somehow has the opportunity to atone for his childhood betrayal later on in life. But the process by which he atones for that betrayal is by being himself subject to a horrific act of violence. And it's as if one act of violence that he bears atones for his failure to prevent the act of violence against his childhood friend way back in the past. And I asked Mr. Hosseini, who was writing about the violent past of events in Afghanistan over the last 40 years, whether he was aware that he was perpetuating notions then of redemptive violence by building in this plot narrative, this central plot component into his book. And he seemed to be genuinely flummoxed or confused by the question. I had a chance to talk to him a little bit afterwards, but I think in some ways he himself has bought into this mythic storytelling narrative structure that only one act of violence will redeem or atone for another elemental act of violence, but didn't seem to be sensitive to the contradiction that might legitimize or prevent acts of violence from becoming cyclical. Because we're all stuck with the lex talionis, the law of retributive justice that goes all the way back to the Hammurabi Code. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. One act of violence can only be resolved or somehow equalized or negated by another act of violence. Of course, Gandhi very famously said, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. And it's very good news for dentists as well, if there's a tooth for a tooth. Jesus' own position on this matter of legal interpretation is very, very clear, but often misunderstood. Jesus tackles the issue of the interpretation of the law of retributive justice head-on in the very famous Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Perhaps the most famous sustained passage of Jesus' teaching in the Gospels. This is the Dalai Lama's favorite part of the Bible. This is one of those parts of one religion's ethical teaching that can kind of be universalized. This is the passage of Jesus' teaching that includes the Golden Rule as well, which you find versions of in all religions. And the technique that Jesus uses in Matthew 5 is to take a legal principle that is familiar within the Torah and then to intensify it. And it always kind of reminds me, as Jesus strategizes in this way, it always reminds me of President Bush's tagline when he was pushing No Child Left Behind, over a decade ago now, in 2001. Remember, before the September 11th attacks, this was the central, other than tax cuts, this was a central policy initiative of the Bush administration, educational reform. And President Bush gave many, many speeches about this issue with Senator Kennedy. Remember, they would often be seen together pushing jointly for this issue. And President Bush would often use this line. He would talk about the soft bigotry of low expectations. The trouble with our education system at the moment is we expect so little of most people, and most students fell down to those low expectations. And there's a kind of bigoted prejudice, built into that system. If we would only raise the standards and raise our expectations of our students and what they're capable of achieving, we would have a much better education system. And as Jesus goes through principle after principle, the principle of retributive justice, he says, you've heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You have heard it was said, thou shalt not murder. You have heard that it was said, thou thou shalt not take God's name in vain. You've heard it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But then his interpretation of the law radically intensifies the ethical standards demanded of his followers. It's not enough to say, I've never murdered anyone. Who's never murdered anyone? Fantastic. We're all righteous under the law. But Jesus says the point of the law against murder is it's the end result of a slippery slope that starts with hatred. Once you hate, once you resent, once you are you hold grudges, then that thing grows and festers and poisons you and metastasizes, and eventually, if not checked, if not repudiated and rejected, that itself will grow and develop and fester into much greater evils itself. Almost all murders, are not, as the late night news would have you, acts of complete strangers. Almost all murders and murder victims have this in common: they know each other. These are broken relationships, employee-employee relationships, neighbors, spousal relationships, brothers and sisters, parents and children. And it's that slippery slope of hatred and resentment, that eventually leads to the outward act. You've heard that it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But Jesus says, even when you begin to lust at another person and think of them as a means to an end, as an objectification of your desire, you're already on that slippery slope that may eventually result in the outward act of adultery. So Jesus eventually comes to the issue of retributive justice. Okay, and I'm going to grab my Bible here. This is in Matthew 5, verse 43. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor. My bad. Verse 38. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. There's the Hammurabi code there. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. Let's just take a look at that paragraph a moment here, because I think this is a much misunderstood paragraph. The myth of redemptive violence seems to suggest that violence itself is built into the central meta-narratives of human behavior. The other great misunderstanding of Jesus' teaching here is that passivity in the face of violence is the only appropriate religious response. Do not resist an evildoer. But that's a terrible mistranslation of what Jesus is saying here. Even in the Oxford Annotated Bible, I say as a graduate of Oxford University. Of course Jesus doesn't mean do not resist an evildoer. What should you do to an evildoer? Resisting an evildoer is exactly what you should do. The question is, how do you resist an evildoer? And the sense of what Jesus is saying here is, do not resist an evildoer with evil. And then the examples that he gives are specifically intended to give options to his disciples for this third way between violent retribution and spectating passivity. He offers his disciples a third way of non-violent resistance of evil, which is the bedrock then of Jesus' own position on violence. Let's just take a look at them very, very quickly. The most misunderstood one is the idea of turning the other cheek. Jesus says, if someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other also. Okay, I'm going to need a help here. Christopher, would you like to be my volunteer? Would you like to come up here? Are you right-handed, Christopher? Yes. Okay, good. All right. So, all right. Jesus says, if someone strikes you on your right cheek. Okay, so go to strike me on my right cheek. Are you sure? Yeah, don't hit me. Okay, but just go as if you were going to strike me in slow motion. Okay, Christopher, you know that this is my right cheek. Yeah, there you go. someone who is right-handed, and everyone in the ancient world is right-handed, even left-handed people are right-handed in the ancient world, they just don't know it. Left in Latin is sinistra, you do evil things, sinister things with your left hand. I've just been in India, and everywhere in India in a bathroom there's like a little pot with some water there on the left-hand side. You know, I'll leave it to your imagination what you do with your left hand. You never shake anyone's left hand. If you are right-handed and you strike someone on the right cheek, you're not throwing a punch, you're back slapping someone. Okay? This is not like two people in a pugilistic confrontation. This is an example of a figure in authority putting someone else in their place. This would be, in the ancient world, paradigms like, sadly, a husband and a wife, a master and a slave, a student in a university, a professor and a student, an employer and an employee, a parent and a child. These are legitimate systems of power and domination which can be enforced by a violent rebuke. So Jesus says, if someone goes to strike you on your right cheek, let's do this again really slow. What should I do? Turn the other cheek. Which cheek? My left cheek. So now I turn my left cheek to Christopher. Now strike me on my right cheek again. How can you do that? No, you're right-handed. You can't get my right cheek now, right? This is like a ninja yoga move. What's going on here? No, I'm showing you my left cheek. See anything like that? When I turn my left cheek and hide my right cheek, what am I inviting him to do? Punch you, yeah. If I turn my left cheek now, I'm saying, you punch me. Thank you very much. Now, if my opponent punches me, in the ancient Jewish way of thinking, the entire power dynamic in the relationship has changed. This is no longer a relationship of a superior and an inferior. Only equals throw punches. So by hiding my right cheek, and taking that backhanded slap, and turning my left cheek, I am now confronting my opponent and inviting him to see me as an equal. And if he's going to practice violence against me, to practice violence against me as an equal. But the entire legal situation changes from a relationship of superior and inferior who can backslap as much as they like, to now a situation of equals throwing punches against one another. This is not advocating passivity. This is not saying, followers of Jesus should just be steamrolled and knocked senseless by their opponents. It is rejecting retributive justice. It is rejecting passivity. But it is inviting the oppressed person to resist evil by calling into question the legitimacy of the violence perpetrated against them in the first place and challenging that violent opponent to rethink their position. And this is the strategy that Jesus uses throughout. Jesus says, if someone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. When do you sue someone for their coat? What do you sue people for? Money, right? If you're suing someone for their coat, either they've got a really amazing Versace coat, or they're broke. And the only thing they've got is literally the coat on their back. Jesus' audience would immediately recognize this. This is not a lawsuit about justice. By the time you've paid the attorneys, the rabbis, to argue your case, and you've got your coat as damages, you're probably going to be out of pocket. This was never about compensation. This was about grinding your opponent into the ground. And this is almost certainly a situation of debt, where the debtor is unable to repay the creditor, who's probably charging exorbitant interest rates. They have no surety, no guarantee, no collateral for their debt, other than literally the coat on their back. And now their vindictive, greedy creditor wants to even strip that from them. So Jesus says, if someone sues you for your coat, give them also your cloak. Now, cloak is something we tend to think of as something that goes over your back, an outer garment. But the word here in Greek means undergarment. Your cloak is what you wear under your coat. So Jesus is saying, if someone takes your coat, if they're that vindictive that they will sue you for your coat, give them your underwear as well. Now, remember, where is this lawsuit taking place? This lawsuit is taking place in the synagogue, in the place of worship, which is also the law court, where legal business is transacted. It's conducted in front of the rabbis, in front of the Pharisees, the legal experts who have been arguing the case. And they're arguing about whether this creditor can legitimately take your coat. And Jesus says, well, if he wants to take every scrap of you, take your underwear off as well and give it to him. And stand naked in front of him in the synagogue, because then your evil creditor has nothing more to take from you. Now, you may have an absolutely ruthless creditor who says, great, I've got your underwear as well, and walks out. And you are standing there in your birthday suit, looking pretty silly. Jesus' audience is probably sniggering as they picture this image. But you hope that your creditor has at least some decency, such that he does not want to see his debtor reduced to nakedness in front of the rabbis. Because it's not so much the fact that the debtor is naked that's the problem, it's who made him naked that would be the issue in the town. Who did this to this man? Stripped him of the last elements of his clothing, reduced him to nakedness and the shame in front of everyone in the town. Hopefully, your creditor will say, too much information, put your cloak back on, here's your coat, this whole lawsuit was frivolous. But you have not resisted with evil, nor have you been passive, but you've upped the ante. You've doubled down, resisted, attempting to win the conscience of your opponent and persuade them to act otherwise. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. This is not about sadistic coaches during PE. There's only one person who can force you to go a mile in the ancient Roman world, and that's a Roman soldier. A Roman soldier who walks around from place to place. Remember why the Romans have got really good roads. They've built really good roads from town to town, very straight and very well built, so they can move their troops around very quickly. This is why the modern freeway system is invented in Italy by Mussolini, the autostradas. He learned from the Romans. Hitler then copied him with the autobahns, and the guy who was the supreme Allied commander in Europe in World War II, Eisenhower, would eventually build the American freeway system for the same purpose during the Cold War in the 1950s. Now, Roman soldiers, as they move around the empire, are carrying an enormous pack with all of their supplies. Their weaponry, their spear, their sword, their shield, their breastplate, their helmet, food, clothes. Hundreds of pounds. And you do not want to arrive at the battlefield exhausted and tired out because you've just been slogging around in the Middle Eastern heat with a 150-pound backpack. You could literally press gang a member of the lower classes into carrying your pack only for 1 mile. Only for 1 mile. And there's method in this. Because the Romans know that you can oppress people, but you can't oppress them to the extent that they will then rebel against you. You've got to squeeze, but just squeeze enough. If someone has to carry your pack, for 3, 4, 5 miles, they're not going to work that day. They've got to walk home, they're exhausted, they're not going to go out into their fields, it's going to affect the economy, it's going to build resentment, people will join the resistance against the Romans, there will be rebellion. And rebellion is much more expensive than peace. Try it. So the Romans know you can push, but not too hard. So Jesus says, if a Roman soldier comes up to you as a Jewish peasant and says, I want you to carry my pack for 1 mile, and this is their mile markers along the Roman roads, when you get to the mile mark, walk a 2nd mile. Saying, this is fun, I'm going to walk another mile with your pack. Now, does think, hang on a minute, if I get caught by my centurion making this person walk 2 miles instead of 1, breaking the rules, I'm going to be on toilet cleaning duty for the next 3 months. And then the Jews in Jesus' audience are picturing the kind of comic, absurd image in their minds of a Roman soldier fighting with a Jewish peasant to get his backpack back, so that he doesn't get into trouble. Because that's what you hope will happen, right? And maybe the next day, when the Roman's marching, and he remembers how embarrassing and humiliating it was to fight with a Jewish peasant the day before to get his backpack back after a mile, he might think, well, maybe I'll just carry it myself today. In each of these examples, Jesus is teaching non-violent strategies against the received wisdom of retributive justice. First of all, principle 1, do not repay evil with evil. Jesus totally repudiates the idea of revenge. But principle 2, do not be oppressed. Do not be a victim. There's a wonderful exchange of letters between Gandhi and Tolstoy in about 1907, 1908. I think Gandhi was in South Africa still at that time. And Tolstoy, the grand old man of Russian letters, who had become a kind of Christian mystic and a Christian ethicist in his later life. And Gandhi had written to him about issues of non-violence and resistance. And Tolstoy writes back to Gandhi and he says, look, there's 120,000 British administrators and troops in India and 300 million Indians. The British are not oppressing you. You are allowing the British to victimize you. Just refuse to cooperate. Refuse to be victimized. And the British hold on India will collapse. And that's exactly what Gandhi will do over the next 30 years when he returned to India. Thirdly, resist, but without sinning. Do not accept that oppression. Resist that oppression, not with evil, not with passivity, but with non-evil means. Now, the hope is that you will change the heart of your oppressor. You will persuade people not to backslap other people into submission, not to sue impoverished debtors for their clothes, not to force peasants to be animals, pack animals that carry around the weapons of Roman oppressors. And in doing so, then, you repay evil with good. When Jesus says immediately in the next paragraph, love your enemies, I don't think he was joking. This is one of those examples where I don't think Jesus is being metaphorical. He's being deadly literal at that point. So, if you look into the specific teachings that Jesus gives about violence and non-violence, I think his position is very, very clear indeed. The problem comes, though, when the last few days of Jesus' life, the crucifixion and the resurrection in particular, are explained by theologians in some way that seems to abstract from everything that went before. The worst example of this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, is, I think, Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, which somehow telescopes the entirety of Jesus' life into just a few hours on Good Friday, and ignores the 30 years, or certainly the 2 or 3 years of public ministry that immediately preceded the events at the end of the last week of Jesus' life. The events of Good Friday and the Easter weekend in Christianity are not seen in any abstraction from their historical antecedents within Judaism itself. And the most obvious way for early Christians to somehow find meaning and significance in the tragic events of Good Friday, where Jesus is crucified, is to reach back into Jewish tradition and to find theological explanations and hypotheses that would somehow explain or impute significance and theological meaning to what happened to Jesus on the cross. Remember, in ancient Judaism, the relationship between God and his people is modulated through a legal agreement, through a covenant between Abraham and his descendants. And Moses is given the fine print of that agreement, in the form of the commandments, not just 10 commandments. Those are like that's the easy to remember list. We've got 10 fingers, we've got 10 commandments for you, but that's just the spark notes. There's actually 613 things you can, but mostly things you can't do in the Torah, in the Jewish law. And if you break any of those laws, somehow that agreement, that covenant with God is breached, and separation exists in between God and his people. And the rituals of atonement, atonement is a word that we get from an English translator of the Bible in the 1520s, a guy called Wycliffe. Anyone see Wolf Hall last night? I'm glad someone did. I've got it on DVR, so I'm looking forward to watching it. I hope some of you read Hilary Mantel's wonderful books about Tudor England and Thomas Cromwell and the British adaptation, which we have to wait 3 months for. Just like we have to wait 3 months for Downton Abbey. The British adaptation is finally being shown on PBS. And this was, I think there's a scene in the, I didn't see last night's episode, but I was reading a review of it online today, and I think there's a scene where Cromwell receives a copy of Wycliffe's translation of the Bible, which was a tremendous crime at that time, to translate the Bible from Latin, which is a translation in the first place, because the Bible was written in Greek and Jesus spoke Aramaic. But receive an English translation of the Bible was a great crime at that time. And this is Wycliffe's translation. And Wycliffe was trying to come up with a word that would explain what was going on in Judaism in order to heal the broken relationship in the covenant. And he came up with this word, atonement. Atonement. He coined that word. But literally it means there's separation, and the rituals you perform at the tabernacle or at the temple will bring you and God into that unity of relationship again. It will make you at one. And that's achieved by making korban, by giving offerings to God that are of significance. Food, possessions, not people. That's what the Abraham and Isaac story is about. We don't do human sacrifices anymore in Judaism. But certainly animals as well. Unblemished animals, sheep, goats, if you're really wealthy, a bull. And then you take the blood of the sacrificed animal and you take it into the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle or in the temple where the Ark of the Covenant is found. It's a beautiful box that contains the tablets of the commandments and the scrolls of the law, and you pour that blood on top of it, on top of the mercy seat here. Kapore. Mercy seat. Kapore also means covering. This is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the Day of Covering. You cover over the Ark of the Covenant with the shed blood of the sacrificial victim. So in some ways, you show or you demonstrate to God what your commitment to healing that relationship between God and his people. You can do that through the offering of animals, or you can do that, according to Leviticus 16, through some peculiar rituals known as scapegoating, where you take a goat and you symbolically place all the sins of the people on the goat and then send the goat out into the desert. Presumably at some point God will reach out and zap the goat, and the goat then is the scapegoat. The goat didn't do anything wrong, just as the sacrificial lamb did nothing wrong, but they are killed, they are offered to God as a substitutionary atonement. So the grammar of atonement in Judaism is the grammar of sacrifice. Literally, in Latin, sacrificio, making something sacred. When you give it to God, when you offer its blood, it becomes holy. This allows you to expiate, to cleanse yourself, to make amends for the sins that you have committed. And this achieves then propitiation with God. That means you appease or satisfy God. Literally, you're giving God something that he likes. You're bribing him almost, so that God will be happy and forget about all the bad stuff that you've done. So there's this idea that you are compensating God, or that a payment is being made by human beings to God in order to bring about this reconciliation. Well, you can see that very quickly then, that language of sacrifice, becomes an easy way then to think about what happens over the Easter weekend. Jesus' death fits very conveniently then into the theological framework of sacrifice. Jesus becomes the Lamb of God, the ultimate sacrificial victim. And unlike the atonement rituals of Judaism that have to be repeated endlessly, year after year after year, in order to bring about atonement, Christians believe that Jesus' death is the perfect sacrificial victim, offered and provided by God himself, and offered to God as an act of obedience, ultimately is efficacious for all time, past, present, and future. But it does not avoid some very disturbing consequences. There is complicated questions in sacrificial rituals about what is being done by whom and to whom. Because Christianity does not offer a doctrine of atonement in its creeds. In the creedal statement, in the Nicene Creed, it says, "For us and for our salvation, he came down from heaven and became incarnate of the Virgin Mary, and then he dies and rises again." Now, it doesn't say how Jesus dies and saves us. It just says he died and saved us. How he does it, though, becomes a perplexing question for early Christian theologians. And they come up with a series of answers, all of which are problematic in their own way. And there are kind of three directions in which atonement theory works in Christianity. One is to think of atonement as something that's being offered to God, which is the sacrificial theory, which has all sorts of problems, which seem to suggest then an act of perhaps Oedipal violence, or an act of child abuse by God against his son, or an act of injustice, where an innocent victim has to pay the consequences for the person who's really responsible for their crimes. Think about the nature of God that emerges from the legitimization of those forms of violence in sacrificial rituals. But then there's another option, which is actually the earliest texts that we find in the Christian Gospels about the atonement, which is known as the ransom theory. And this is kind of funny. I was just explaining it to my 8th graders today, and they couldn't make head or tail of it. The ransom theory, which we find in the words of Jesus himself, where he says, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many," suggests then that the real predicament in the relationship between God and humanity is that Satan, the forces of evil, have kidnapped humanity. And the forces of evil must be paid off in order to ransom humanity, to free and liberate them. And so God achieves this by giving to Satan, his opponent, his adversary, his accuser, that which is most valuable to God, which is the life of his son. And when Satan is presented with the life of his son, he ransoms or liberates humanity and frees them and returns them to God. And then, for some reason, God does a switcheroo on Satan and raises Jesus from the dead, and tricks Satan entirely into releasing humanity when he wasn't really paid off in the first place. I don't know how you make sense of this kind of charade of ransom and payments and paying off Satan as if Satan is somehow owed payment instead of God. But there are all sorts of perplexing problems with that idea of atonement as well. The last idea of atonement, and this is perhaps the most underrepresented idea of atonement in Christianity, particularly today, is the idea that atonement is an act of God towards humanity. That God incarnates himself in the world in Jesus of Nazareth and presents to the world a perfect ideal or exemplification of what a human being ought to be and how a human being ought to live in harmony with God. And the response of human beings to that is to dehumanize and violently destroy that incarnation in the most barbaric way possible. The violence done across then is the violence of humanity towards God. And the God who hangs on the cross then, pronouncing forgiveness for the sins of those who nailed him to the cross, is God's ultimate protest then against human methods of redemptive violence. The idea that the priests and the Romans thought that they could somehow save the nation by offering Jesus as a sacrificial victim, that one person should die for the sake of the nation, ultimately reaches its point of total bankruptcy in the crucifixion itself. So, how then does forgiveness work? How then does redemption work? It works through forgiveness. What does forgiveness demand? There doesn't seem to be any situations in the Christian Gospels where Jesus makes forgiveness or healing conditional upon some act of retributive violence. Just think in particular about this image here, the parable of the prodigal son, which is perhaps the most famous story that Jesus tells in Luke 15 to try and explain the nature of divine forgiveness. About this terrible, good-for-nothing younger son who wishes his old man was dead because he wants his money and goes off and wastes his inheritance on hookers and drugs in Las Vegas, and then somehow shows up hoping to be accepted back not as a son but as a slave when a famine hits him in a foreign land. And we're all flabbergasted by the father who, instead of beating him within an inch of his life, or disinheriting him, or kicking him out, or destroying all knowledge of him, nevertheless sees him when he's far off and runs towards him and throws his arms around him and kisses him and puts a robe on him and puts sandals on his feet and puts his ring on the finger and kills the fatted calf to celebrate the return of his son, who he was afraid was lost but has been found, who he thought was dead but is in fact alive. Now, how does the father forgive the younger son? He just does. Does he have to go out and kill the sacrificial victim in order to have the younger son's sins propitiated? No. He's got an elder son, who's supposedly the good son, who's been working the whole time in his field doing his father's business, who is furious to discover the means by which his father attempts to forgive his younger brother. But the idea that the elder son would be taken out by his father and crucified as an innocent victim so that the younger son could be forgiven would be preposterous. But somehow, many Christians seem to operate as if that's what God is doing over the Easter weekend. Crucifying the innocent elder brother, who's actually not so innocent after all, he's deeply full of resentment and righteous indignation, in order to forgive the younger son. We forget, the cross, remember, although it's become a holy image within Christianity, was intended by the Romans as the most profoundly violent image imaginable. It was an execution device. Imagine people wearing little jeweled gas chambers, or guillotines, or gallows around their neck. We've been so desensitized in many ways to the violence and the brutality and the terrorism of crucifixion. This is state-sponsored terrorism. Those horrifying videos that we used to see from Al-Qaeda in Iraq and that we now see from ISIS, where Jihad John, with his English accent, saws off the head of the latest unfortunate victim. This is what crucifixion is to the Romans. It's supposed to scare the crap out of anyone so nobody rebels. This is shock and awe, Roman style. And then somehow then we could think, or Christians could interpret the crucifixion as intended by God, as part of God's plan, as a legitimization of some violent ritual sacrifice in order to bring about atonement. Just seems to be a total perversion of both Jesus' message and the actual events of that final weekend. We have been stuck with this desire of creating a sort of mysticism about Jesus' ability to withstand pain. Christianity is an endurance contest. This was particularly popular in medieval Christianity. The lower orders, would identify with the suffering of Jesus, his wounds, the fact that he was God-forsaken and humiliated and outcast, because they would find some sense of righteousness, in their own circumstances and situations by connecting their experience to Jesus. You saw a great example of this in the movie Amistad, where the African slaves who were being held in prison are given Bibles by these very well-meaning kind of waspy Protestants. Of course they don't read English, but they are looking through these 19th century Bibles and seeing these kind of beautiful illustrations, like these Gustave Doré illustrations of this person who seems to suffer terribly, and the African slaves draw obvious parallels and analogies between their situation and their circumstances as people who are captured and enslaved and brought across on these ships, and they're having their lives weighed up in this judicial process, and the person depicted in these stories. Here's someone who very much legitimized this notion of redemptive violence. Mother Teresa famously withheld many forms of narcotics from her patients in her institutions, because she believed that the more they suffered, the closer they were to Christ, and the more they mystically enjoyed the benefits of God's salvation. There's a wonderful little clip that was captured on camera of her saying to a poor man suffering from a terminal disease, "Jesus must be kissing you," she says to him in Bengali. And he replies plaintively, "Then please tell him to stop kissing me." And as we said, perhaps the worst endorsement of this idea of redemptive violence is found in Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, released about 11 or 12 years ago now. I think 2004, this movie came out. And of course, if you've seen various films within Mel Gibson's oeuvre, you know that they're all variations on a theme, whether it's The Patriot, whether it's Braveheart, whether it's his movie Apocalypto. Nearly every Mel Gibson movie is a kind of textbook example of the myth of redemptive violence. A terrible act of violence is done to the central character, and the only way they can overcome and escape and somehow transcend the wound or the pain or the suffering or hurt that they have endured is themselves, to endure or to inflict upon another another atoning, liberating act of violence themselves. The best-selling author within the evangelical Christian world remains C.S. Lewis, who legitimizes this idea of redemptive violence in the Narnia books. Aslan, of course, remember the wonderful Leonine Jesus, who dies as a sacrificial victim on the altar to save the Pevensey children, then comes back the next day and eats all of his enemies for breakfast. It'd be like Jesus coming down off the cross, rising again, and then opening up with a machine gun. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. C.S. Lewis famously wrote in his book On Suffering and Evil, The Problem of Pain. If that's true, then God is a sadist. So there are complicated issues about, I'm very conscious of how long I've been speaking here, and I'm just kind of skipping through here, about what kind of concept of God emerges then from the doctrines of atonement and the theories of what is going on the cross and what is taking place over the Easter weekend, in order to explain those specific elements of Jesus' biography. Are you going to end up with a loving God who somehow offers to humanity an image of moral perfection that a depraved humanity rejects, and that God somehow attempts to transcend by claiming to forgive the human beings who nailed him to the cross? Or are you going to end up with a God who, in some kind of bizarre, ancient blood ritual, sends his own flesh and blood to die a brutal death in order to expiate his desire for blood. This doesn't seem to tie in with the story of the narrative of the life of Jesus of Nazareth, whose favorite verse in the Jewish scriptures is Hosea 6, verse 6, which he keeps on repeating, "I demand mercy," says God, "not sacrifice." I don't want empty blood rituals if they mean nothing, or they are disconnected or abstracted from your ability to be compassionate and forgiving towards your fellow human beings. Instead, the cross offers an image of unconditional love, conditioned perhaps only to the extent that the straightforward forgiveness of God is reciprocated in the willingness of the follower to be forgiving themselves. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think, or my reading of the Gospels is that the violent death of Jesus on the cross is itself a divine protest against all notions of redemptive violence, all ideas that somehow violent retribution can somehow legitimate and atone for a sin of any kind. We see this most profoundly in the return of a prodigal son. And to just kind of return to where we started today, there was an episode on the Colbert Report where Stephen Colbert was talking about some provisions of a spending bill in Congress that had stripped out some of the funding mechanisms for the poorest of the poor in the United States, the week before Christmas. And he said, again, now, without being satirical, without being ironic, if this is going to be a Christian nation that doesn't help the poor, either we have to pretend that Jesus was just as selfish as we are, or we've got to acknowledge that he commanded us to love the poor and serve the needy without condition, and then admit that we just don't want to do it. If we end up then with a violent redemption or a violent atonement, that I'm a theologian, I'm a global scholar, but you can see some of the ultimate implications then of working with a theological doctrine of violent conflict resolution as it's then projected and extrapolated on the international scale. We're in exactly the same position if we want to believe somehow in a non-violent Jesus, but somehow extrapolate a violent atonement and a myth of redemptive violence from his death. Thank you.
So we're going to take a couple of questions real quick. So just raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come along.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you explain the verse where Jesus says in the garden before the Romans captured him that 2 or 3 swords was enough?
Yeah, exactly. 2 or 3 swords is enough to do what? Yeah, Jesus mentions swords twice. Yes, twice. There is, 3 times Jesus mentions swords in the Gospels. There's one point where Jesus says, do not think I've come to bring peace between brother and sister, between father and son, between mother and daughter. I've come to bring a sword. Now, is Jesus talking literally there? Is he thinking of arming domestic disputes? No, I think he means there that his message is going to be divisive, even within families. And perhaps Jesus' own relationship with his family is perhaps the best example of that, where in Mark chapter 3, when Jesus goes back to his hometown, everyone in Nazareth thinks he's crazy, and his family, his mother and his brothers come to lead him away, to bind him, it says in Mark's Gospel, because they think he's nuts too. So Jesus is clearly being divisive within his own family. In that story in the garden, where Jesus is contemplating his own death, and then the armed soldiers of the temple arrive to arrest Jesus with Judas. In one gospel, the disciples pull out their swords. Peter, I think, pulls out his sword and cuts off the ear of the chief priest's servant. And Jesus says to him, "Put up your sword, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And then he heals the ear of the chief priest's servant. So, one of the early Christian theologians, Tertullian, I think I had it up on the screen earlier, very famously said, when Jesus disarmed the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, he disarmed all Christians. Okay. There is a verse, though, in Luke's Gospel where Jesus is quoting a prophecy where he says, he shall be numbered with the transgressors. He's quoting from Isaiah chapter 53, where Isaiah seems to be envisioning some sort of suffering being who's being tortured and killed to somehow bring about redemption for all humanity. It's in some ways a projection of Israel itself suffering. And Jesus says, after quoting that text, he says, well, if you don't have a sword, get some money and buy one. How many swords do we have? And the disciples say, well, we have 2 or 3. Well, Jesus said, well, that will be enough. Enough for what? Enough to violently overthrow the Roman Empire? 2 or 3 fishermen from Galilee with swords? No, I think what Jesus means there, that will be enough to fulfill the prophecy. That if they find me with a couple of my followers armed, they'll think I'm a transgressor, they'll think I'm a criminal, they'll think I'm a rabble-rouser, and that will be enough of a justification then to have me crucified. But the idea that that's, every Second Amendment Christian's favorite verse is palpably a misreading of the text. Because how can 2 or 3 swords be enough if Jesus is legitimating violent retribution to the superstructure of Roman authoritarianism?
A couple of points. First of all, you mentioned the Nicene Creed. I've always wondered about that. Jesus was crucified, died, was buried, and descended into hell. Where did that descended into hell?
The descended into hell bit is in the Apostles' Creed, not in the Nicene Creed, which predates the Nicene Creed. But it's a...
Well, nonetheless, why don't he descend into hell?
I'm not sure I completely understand that particular piece of the text as well, but I think it means that the full consequences of Jesus' death, theologically understood, that if Jesus is regarded as a sin offering, then he goes as far as sin goes, which is as if he's being punished in hell. But then, when he's vindicated and justified by God on Sunday and raised again, he's pulled up out of hell. There is a peculiar verse, I think, in one of Peter's letters, where it talks about Jesus descending and preaching the gospel to people in hell. So even people in hell hear the message of the gospel. But it's a rather mystical verse.
And then the whole matter of the crucifixion. I mean, if God is all-knowing, and if the Trinity, all 3 parts are all-knowing, then isn't it just theater for him? He knows that on the third, it's sort of like a TDY. He's going TDY for 3 days. It's sort of like, he knows it's not for real, but it's sort of for theater for the people through the ages. And
But
I find it hard, as was brought up as a Catholic, but the more I think of these things, like, I go with the messages of Jesus, of kindness and love thy neighbor, but these dogmas are just sort of superstition.
If you're a strict Trinitarian, and the Trinity is a mystery even to theologians, but if you're a strict Trinitarian, the death of Jesus on the cross is not something that the Father and the Holy Spirit do against the Son. It would be something that happens within God itself. So it's an experience that God the Father and God the Holy Spirit participate in. So that I suppose you could argue in an extreme interpretation, mortality and death and the finality of death enters into the reality of God. So that God experiences everything that human beings experience. So one way of seeing then the incarnation and the life of Jesus is an act of divine empathy. You could argue God ultimately is separated from human beings' experience of tragedy and suffering and evil. But to the extent that God himself strips himself of his divinity and becomes a human being in Jesus of Nazareth, then suffering and death on the cross become part of divine experience too. No, I don't think that necessarily answers your ultimate question about whether this is all theatre, but it would change the definition to some extent of what we mean by the word God. God is immortal in that sense that it also includes suffering and death. Those are not excluded from God's experience. We're getting very theological here.
That's the facet of the God.
Yeah, that's right. But the idea that God is, what's the word they used to use? Impassible, incapable of suffering, would be a libel against the crucifixion. Because then you'd have to say that God somehow ensured himself against what Jesus experiences. But you can't say that Jesus is God and that God doesn't die on the cross.
My question has to do with the most popular Christian interpretation of Jesus' crucifixion being that he was kind of an atonement, like you said, for sin. And then you're talking about there being a difference between the metaphorical and the literal. When you're reading the Gospels, how would you propose that you differentiate when it is metaphorical and when it's literal?
Oh my God. in half an hour?
The short version.
Well, this is a very difficult question because Jesus' favorite way of teaching is not to be propositional. Jesus does not say, do this, do that. Jesus likes to tell stories. He tells somewhere between 60 and 70 stories in the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He doesn't tell any stories in John, but in the first three Gospels, he tells a lot of stories. And of course, none of these stories are intended to be understood literally. These stories about sowers and seeds and marriages and debtors and evil stewards and prodigal sons. None of those stories are intended to be literal, but all of those stories are intended to be revelatory about the nature of the kingdom of God and the things of God, as opposed to the values and the principles of the things of human beings. So that process of separation of the parabolic and the literal historic, has to take place within the Gospels themselves. Now, to what extent, are the stories about Jesus then literal and historical, or symbolic or metaphorical? The historical answer is we don't know. No one. We don't have the YouTube videos of the Sermon on the Mount. We don't have the eyewitness accounts in the Capernaum Times the next day of what Jesus was saying in the synagogue the day before. We have an unfortunate historical gap of somewhere between 40 and 50 years from the time that Jesus of Nazareth arrived to the time that the texts were written about him. But this is not a problem that's unique to Christians. This is a problem of history, right, and interpretation. About trying to sift the evidence, trying to fit the evidence to what we know of human experience and what we know of historical veracity. And if you try to find your entire truth within inside the text itself, you're going to find yourself believing all sorts of ridiculous things that no one really believes. There are all sorts of things in the Bible that are factually incorrect or involve logical contradiction, or that we would find ethically abhorrent today. So we are using standards all the time. Even, I've never met a fundamentalist. I've met people who claim to be fundamentalists, but they wear polyester and they go to 7-Eleven on Sundays, and they don't burn their children when they talk back to them. No one is literally a fundamentalist in that sense. So people are always using rational, historical, traditional criteria in order to interpret those texts. I suppose the question is, to what extent do you do that? And how disturbing is that to your own particular model of faith? To find certain narratives about Jesus to be symbolic, rather than being literal or historical true, and whether it really matters or not.
First of all, I think it's you speak of Jesus as if he was just a man, just a public figure like Gandhi. I have a question, it's more of personal curiosity. Are you religious?
Am I?
Religious.
I am religious. Well, I once saw, what's his name, Cornel West speak at USD, and someone asked him if you were religious. He said, no, I'm not religious, but I am trying to be a Christian.
Well, I guess this is just a personal curiosity for me. You don't have to answer if it's too personal, but I'm an atheist, but it's always fascinating for me to meet religious theologists because I always think that the more you study something, the more disillusioned you would naturally become with it. So I was curious that since you have the insight to see Jesus as just a man and to think about this logically, how does this thought process and what you know about religion influence your own beliefs?
Well, you know, my own particular faith journey is in reverse. You know, I was actually brought up as a religious fundamentalist, and I disabused myself of many of those beliefs when I went to university and had them challenged, you know, by historical criticism and by contrary opinions that I'd never been able to explore before because they were regarded as down to a heresy. But I never lost my interest in the stories, the narratives, you know, and you know, maybe that's why I ended up specializing in theology. I'm with Gandhi, you know, on this point. You know, I think Christianity is so disreputable. You know, I teach teenagers, but I've taught college kids for the last 15 years as well. And you know, if you play word association with college kids and use the word religion, the words that come into their head is intolerant, misogynistic, homophobic, narrow-minded, obscurantist, superstitious, anti-scientific. You know, that's the rep that religion in general and specific religions in particular are dealing with. You know, with you know, Generation Y and millennials and post-millennials today, you have an extremely negative view of Christianity and Judaism and Islam and religion in general. But almost all will describe themselves as being spiritual. So, you know, I've got a book on my shelf at home called Jesus Against Christianity. And I would say that's probably closest to my position.
Interesting.
I actually think that is going to have to be our last question for tonight. So thank you very much, Doctor, for